that was just a transformative moment. And so we see this organizing that's taking place not only out in the West Coast with Patrice and her group, but all around the nation. And it really became crystallized back in 2014 with the shooting of Mike Brown. And that's when you see the Black Lives Matter hashtag really taking off in that way. And so it's really that momentum has just continued. And unfortunately, there have been the continuation of all from Sandra Bland to Eric Gardner. The social media aspect of this has really given it a whole new life. But I will say, too, even though the hashtag is something specific to what we're dealing with, to understand that people have been essentially claiming and fighting for the worldview that Black Lives Matter since the colonial period. When we talk about American history and the continued devaluation of Black lives in the society, that has been a fight that's been fairly constant in our existence in this nation, and it's just now taking a different format. So this is a very old story.
So I'm going to ask Nadege, like, as far as covering Black Lives Matter in the workplace, do you feel any kind of resistance when doing so?
Not in my particular newsroom, no. I will say that our newsroom has been very open to covering the issues that matter in our community, whatever they are, including Black Lives Matter, including issues around race, around policing, and all that entails. So I have not encountered any specific resistance in anyone telling me, no, you can't tell these stories, or even like, here's how you should tell this story.
So my other question for both of you, how do we or do you think the media does a good job of quelling the notion in the public that Black Lives Matter is not saying that Black lives matter more than white lives? Do you think the media does a good job of doing that?
I'll take a stab at that one. Actually, no. I think one of the issues that really is frustrating to me, and I've talked to a lot of my friends about, is, how do you get this message across to what still continues to be because it seems like you shout Black Lives Matter, it goes into the hopper and the spinner, and on the other end it comes out as I hate police. And there's just this rampant oversimplification of the message that just happens time and time again. I mean, with, say, post-Super Bowl right now, right? And, even though she was trying to make a very positive statement, a very affirmative statement for Black history and Black culture, the reaction among police, including the Miami Fraternal Order of Police, has been to in her shows and all these other kind of consequences that she's having to face, quote unquote, from the people on the other side of the debate. I really wish that we could have a deeper conversation across kind of racial boundaries where we could get people to understand the crux of that message. If you listen carefully, I think that the leaders do a fantastic job of communicating that, but it's just they're not being heard in the media spin.
Nadege, what are your thoughts on that?
I think for me as a journalist, it's going beyond the obvious. A lot of times, like the media will go out and cover like a Black Lives Matter protest or something of that nature, and then I was like, oh, that's a Black Lives Matter story. But having talked to Black Lives Matter folks here on the ground in Miami and other places, it's not just about, the more obvious story, which is, okay, here's a protest with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. It's the more nuanced stories. Black Lives Matter is about socioeconomics. It's about crime. It's about policing. It's about these larger issues in the Black community. And what I hear often is that these stories need to be told and need to be covered, and not just the obvious, the formation story or what Javier Ortiz has to say, right? That's the sexy story. That's the clickbait story that's going to get clicks. The Fraternal Order of Police said he won't, show up to Beyoncé's concert. I mean, the City of Miami Police has said that he really doesn't really have that option, right? If they need police officers to patrol the Beyoncé concert, the patrol officers are going to do their jobs. So sometimes it's giving a lot of airtime to certain voices and not going into the more nuanced stories of what it actually means to cover the Black community.
So as journalists, what can we do to get past what you just said, the sexiness of the story, when we're covering this movement?
To go out there and cover it, you know, to go beyond the obvious, to dig and to tell those stories. You know, it's not just about the press conferences, it's not just about, you know, the press releases, it's about going out into our communities and covering the very real issues that affect them, jobs, and covering the successes as well. Black Lives Matter is not just all grim death and destruction either. It's Black lives living, it's Black lives succeeding, and those stories need to be told. Oftentimes when I go into the Black communities, especially here in Miami, one of the main critiques you hear of the media in Miami is that you guys show up when we die, right? You show up, you know, at the crime scenes, but you are not telling the stories of the living, of the successes, and even the challenges. Don't just show up for this one thing. Keep coming back.
Speaking of that too, when we're covering like race-related issues, how do you think that we can fairly cover these issues when a lot of newsrooms are becoming less diverse? How can we do that? Dr. Hobbs, you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, the sound went out on me.
Oh, could you hear me? I was talking about how can we cover more race-related issues when a lot of the news, or cover them fairly when we have a lot of newsrooms that are coming less diverse. How can we do that?
I would defer to the two of you since you're actively in that industry. I'm on the outside, but I do want to take a moment and just commend Nadege. I'm a big fan of hers on WLRN. I love the stories that she brings. You're doing the work of painting pictures of a very diversified culture here in South Florida, and I think we need more of that. But I think, you know, when I look at the very narrow parameter of the Black Lives Matter, I think there just is just a lot of resistance to trying to even understand what that is. Somebody mentioned nuance earlier, that we need to search for nuance. We're not a nation of nuance anymore. We're the nation of Donald Trump. I mean, and so, I mean, when I look at some of those things, it makes it seem like such an uphill battle for us to have kind of the conversation across communities to kind of get towards something better. But Nadege makes me hopeful.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hobbs. For my part, I will say diversity is important in the newsroom across different sectors, right? Not just diversity in skin color, diversity in socioeconomic background is important in the newsroom as well, and different thought processes. Our newsroom is pretty small, so I think I'm the only Black reporter in the newsroom right now. We have Terrence Shepard, who's, you know, the Black editor in the newsroom. We have, you know, Hispanic population newsroom. Some of our reporters are white. But I don't think that in order to tell these stories, you have to be Black, right? In order to tell these stories well, you don't have to be Black. You have to get it. You have to go out. You have to do the reporting, and you have to spend time in the communities. That's not to say, though, that diversity in the newsroom is not an important and very relevant topic. When we talk about coverage, when we talk about how things are covered, that is, I think it's super important. I mean, after the whole hashtag Oscar so white hashtag came out recently, immediately following that, there was a very smaller niche hashtag that was journalism so white, and having that conversation on social media on, you know, what does diversity in the newsroom look like, and not just in the newsroom, but in newsroom leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So my next question. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was because one of the pieces that I saw that you participated in, Nadege, was dealing with policing in South Florida. I thought it was very balanced. I wonder what the reaction was for your listeners. What did you hear back from them with that story? Did you get people to maybe understand a little bit more?
Which story was that? I'm sorry, I did a lot of policing stories in the past year.
There was one that I think was on the Sunshine. I forget the show that's on WLRN. But
Oh,
it
the
was
Sunshine Economy. Yeah, it was an
yes,
hour-long
thank you.
program on policing. You know, we got very good reaction from that. Community members who were very happy to hear that story. The police officers were especially the police officers in Liberty City. They're like, this is a part of policing that no one ever talks about, that you don't necessarily see because the good stuff don't always make the news, and sometimes we just don't know what's going on. And so getting that behind the scenes, and just on background, she's talking about a community policing story in Liberty City where we profiled a police officer named Daniel McComb, who is a community resource officer in that neighborhood, who approaches his job differently than what you would think of when you think policing. So he had a book club in the neighborhood, and you know, like the young men in the neighborhood talk to him, even though they say they don't like the police, they like him because he takes the time out to talk to him. And I think part of it is being of the community. Daniel was raised in Miami. He speaks like the kids. He looks like the kids in that neighborhood. And so that there was a connection that he wasn't an outsider, that he was part of their community. And he made it known in that way because he built the trust in that neighborhood. So, but the reaction was pretty positive. I got a lot of reaction from law enforcement and from community members on hearing that story. And just hearing those interactions that you don't always see behind the scenes because reporters aren't always there when officers are doing their jobs. And many of them do their jobs well.
So, Dr. Hobbs, one of the questions I was going to ask you, do you think, or what organizations do you think have done a really good job with covering Black Lives Matter?
You know, most of my media comes through the internet and Facebook. So those are the places where I typically find my stories. And often it's coming from people who are doing the work. I would start with like a Griot or the Root.com that do a really good job. I'm a big fan of the Crunk Feminist Collective, Brittany Cooper and some of those folks. Brittany Cooper is at Rutgers University, and they do a really good job of dealing with not only Black feminism, but Black radicalism and intersectionality. So there are a lot of think pieces that come through those venues. Yeah, I mean, those are some of the main ones that I'm pulling from these days. I say the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates is just amazing, and some of the pieces that he's been able to put out are really wall in terms of people's understanding. His book Between the World and Me, I did a book discussion over in Miami Shores about that, and it just there's a lot of language there that empowers people to be able to push forward. So I'm very thankful for his voice. So the Atlantic definitely, I think, has their finger on the pulse.
Okay, this question is from our audience, and either one of you can step in and go ahead and answer this one. It's from Clayton. He wants to know if there's any way the community can change the way that police officers are trained, and what are our thoughts on that?
I've been with the Community Relations Board here in Miami. I've been to a number of sessions about police and community trust. The frustrating thing is about those conversations is that I think that we always are talking to enforcers instead of people who actually have the power to change the laws and change the training. I think that we need to kind of think more strategically about our power as voters and what we can control and influence in terms of the politics behind all of it. People are only going to move, your mayors are only going to move, your city commissions are only going to move when they know that you have a mobilized and effective electorate who are going to push the envelope if their needs are not being met. We have to remember that these police officers are public servants, and we have a lot of say in the way they police. And if we abdicate that responsibility, we see what we get in the midst of that. So I think we have to think about movements and not isolated protests in reaction to tragedy.
I agree with Dr. Hobbs. What I've seen as a reporter, what has worked when it comes to community being able to change policy is having some sort of organized movement of some sort. For example, after the spree of shooting of Black men in the city of Miami, where I believe it was 7 Black men who were killed by Miami police officers, part of the reason, well, the federal government also stepped in and told them that they had to clean up, but part of the reason why you saw such a big shift and, you know, the politicians getting involved and asking for certain things to change was because community members got involved and they showed up at City Hall and they called the mayor and they made it known that, like, we're not okay with this. We are not okay with this. It took 7 Black men to die before you really saw that big upswell. Like, you know, after the first, the second, the third, you didn't hear that much, and then eventually it was just like a cacophony, like, okay, like, really? But it changed some things, right? There's more of a focus now on community policing and less on what we call the jump out boys, which are the tactical teams in neighborhoods. And so there has been a change in how, at least in the city of Miami, even in Miami-Dade County, on a shift away from, you know, tactical teams, more not specialized units, but more one-on-one interactions with community members. And I personally seen that out while reporting in the county and in the city of Miami in certain neighborhoods where you even hear the patrol and beat officers saying, you know, we have to get out of our cars, we have to talk to people. It's a shift in thinking when it comes to policing.
So also, Nadege, when we're covering the topics of Black Lives Matter, how can we go beyond rallies, police brutality? How can we go a step further to effectively cover Black Lives Matter?
This is where Journalism 101 jumps in, right? Shoe leather reporting, not just helicoptering or jumping into communities when there's fire, but being there before there's fire, right? Getting to know community members and being in the community, not for a story, but just to go out into the community and get to know people. I mean, I'm a Miami native. I'm a Miami girl through and through. I went to Miami Northwestern High School. Like, I know Liberty City. I know Overtown. I know Little Haiti. I know Miami Gardens. And I know it in a way that's not, you know, like, who are the talking heads? Like, I know community members. I go to people's houses and I've had lunch and dinner with them. Like, I eat in these neighborhoods. I used to get my hair done in Liberty City. So, like, for me, being in the community in a way that's not always apparent, like I'm here as a journalist, works because people get to know you. I think as journalists, you know, we spend a lot of time asking for people to tell us about them, but they know absolutely nothing about us. And part of, you know, reporting out of neighborhoods that historically have a distrust of media is gaining their trust. You can't gain that trust when you show up to a crime scene when someone dies. That's not how you get to know people. Yes, you should be out there to cover that, but you should not only be in those communities when that happens. You should be there before it happens and then be there after. Go back, follow up. You know, a lot of times when I go out into Black communities, one of the things you often hear is that, you know, you guys just show up for the headlines and your TV trucks and then you're gone. You don't come back until the next one. But between that, there are still stories to be told. And so I think it's on us as reporters to be held accountable as far as going out into the communities, getting to know the communities, so that you can do those deep dive stories. There's no way you can do those stories if you don't know where you're going or who you're talking to.
So we want to encourage everyone who's joining us. I don't know if I cut you off. I can't tell, but to send in some questions, some more questions, because this is one question that we got from the audience. You, Nadege, you touched on you don't have to be Black to cover Black Lives Matter, but the question came in: what advice would you give to reporters who are not Black to accurately cover the Black experience?
The same advice I would give any reporter is to go out and get to know the community. Like, I used to cover city government, which is a completely different world, right? I knew nothing about covering City Hall. I knew nothing about the legalese that they speak at City Hall. But when I got in there, I got to know what I was doing. I did my research. I knew what I was talking about because I was well informed. That's the most important part, you know, being well informed, doing your research, spending time so that you do get those nuance, right? Because some stories are not as black and white as they appear on deadline. So, you know, sometimes you have to get that quick and dirty story out and say this thing happened, but then you can go back and flesh that out and figure out what are the stories here to tell. So for me, it's all about getting to know the communities. There are plenty of white reporters who cover Black communities and cover them very well because they immerse themselves in the community and they get to know these communities. That's how you tell any story as a journalist. If you don't know what you're talking about, you shouldn't be talking.
Okay, good. So Dr. Hobbs, I have a question for you. Do you think that the mainstream media is held accountable for the way it covers race-related issues by organizations like the NAACP, NABJ, and the Urban League? What are your thoughts?
I think so. I mean, I think that they definitely are trying to push against the narrative. I think that they're out doing things. The march that was staged from South Carolina, I think, to Washington D.C. last year, the NAACP put forward. But it's always this complicated issue of yes, you can have the, but what about penetration? Do people in other communities, are they actually absorbing this message? I think that is something that is difficult to put one's finger on. I'd be interested in hearing from the two of you about how do you really measure if people on the other end of your hard work and the stories that you're telling so very well, do they get it? Do they get the nuance that is represented in what we're talking about with Black Lives Matter? Because if there's anything that gives me a lot of discomfort, it's that. I think that as a historian and looking at this from a very long time, I mean, Ida B. Wells was talking about, Frederick Douglass was talking about the same thing during his day. David Walker in 1829, you know, was it, of course it's going to go out of my head, but David Walker in 1829 in Boston, when he's talking about, you know, colored people in the world, we need to unite, we need to fight against slavery and what the world is putting before us. You know, this is a very, very old phrase. This is a very, very old thought. Are we really making any progress even in 2016? I take, for example, the story that came out of Washington, D.C., that the headlines would have you believe that Black Lives Matter attacked a Marine. But if you dig a little deeper, what you see is that these were teens who were out doing no good, and because they asked their victim, do you think Black Lives Matter, before they attacked and robbed him, that now gets connotated and labeled as Black Lives Matter. See what you guys do, you're just encouraging this type of behavior. Such bad journalism. What people understand about this movement in other communities, I think that there's a tendency to lean towards those types of interpretation without doing the homework, and I just don't have a sense of how you combat that.
There's one question that we have that we got on Twitter. I'm looking at it right now. One second. So, Nadege, if you want to answer this one. If the community wants their police officers retrained, what responsibility do you think that the press holds to convey that message?
We tell the stories, you know, if the community want police officers retrained, and they've expressed that, and they have, and I've actually done those stories on police and training, especially around mental health after the shooting of Laval Hall in Miami Gardens. We tell those stories by either you getting in touch with the reporter personally, if there's an event happening around police training and like a community forum type of situation, that's something that the press would go out to cover. One of the things that I found is that there's a disconnect. Like, how do you get in touch with the media? Like, how do you get the media to tell your story? That's a worthwhile question because every newsroom is different. How you access every newsroom is different. And so if you're not media savvy and you don't know the emails to send things to and you're sending it to like a generic newsroom inbox, no one ever responds, and you say, well, no one wants to tell my story. But sometimes it's that they don't know. They didn't get your message, or you didn't know who to reach out to. And so that's a very real part of the issue when we talk about representation and what we cover, right? Some people are very media savvy, and so they know how to get their message to the media very quickly. And this is why I say as reporters, it's on us as well to dig for those stories and not just wait for press releases, because not every community knows how to get you that press release, nor not every community has time to send you a press release, because they're out here really doing the work and they're not thinking about whether or not this media outlet or this media outlet is coming to cover us. So that's why we should be plugged into the community so that we know when these things are happening to go.
So for both of you, when we talk about Black Lives Matter in social media, because it's all over social media, Twitter, everything like that, do you think that it kind of takes the place of having those stories told in mainstream newspapers or on a mainstream out just there? What do you think? What are your thoughts?
I don't think so. Personally, go ahead, Dr. Hobbs.
I was just going to ask her to repeat. I'm getting a little break up here. I didn't hear the beginning part of her question.
Sorry. So I was talking about Black Lives Matter and social media and Twitter especially. And one of the questions came from Corey, and he asked, will social media kind of supplement the need to have our stories in mainstream newspapers?
I think social media definitely helps. I think there are narratives that we would never hear if there wasn't Twitter, and in fact, or if there wasn't Facebook. There are vlogs and blogs and videos that allow you, and in fact, sometimes inform news stories. Sometimes the story breaks on Twitter, and you're like, oh, that's a story. We should cover that. And I think that's totally fair. I use social media a lot as a journalist, as a jumping off point for sourcing, for background even. So it's an excellent tool, and I think social media has forced broader stories to be told, because now you kind of get to control your narrative a little bit. I love Black Twitter, right? Black Twitter like does its thing and and brings attention to things that sometimes you would not otherwise have heard of. But you log on and you see Black Twitter going in, and you're like, oh, you know, like I didn't even know that this was happening. And so I think social media definitely brings in a voice. I don't take everything I see at face value on social media, just as I wouldn't if I was on the streets and someone was talking to me as a reporter, and as one who does her job, I think, pretty well. You need to vet what you see, right? You need to vet what you hear, because some like every week you hear someone died on social media and it isn't true, right? Like the person is still alive. And so not everything on social media is necessarily accurate, but I think that it gives at least that jumping off point, and it gives a voice that there was a void there, and I think it fills that. But as journalists, I don't think we should blindly retweet facts and things like that unless you verify it and make sure that it is in fact accurate. Because we don't want to be in the business of sharing, you know, inaccurate or incomplete information. So there's that too.
Definitely.
I would like to share a story. I think that social media is incredibly powerful. I remember watching the Mike Brown story unfold, and it was electrifying. It was disheartening as you got those reports from people who were there on the ground in Ferguson, and what they were witnessing, and the pictures of his body laying in the street. It just was terrible. But I also remember when the media finally picked up on the story, the national media. I remember watching Brian Williams, who was still in the air for NBC at the time. The report that he gave was so very different from everything that I had been reading weekend, and it was incredibly disheartening, honestly. I mean, you would think that I would be a little bit more of a cynic and not fall for it, but it was just such a gap between what people were saying on the ground and in the communities and what was being reported. And I think there's real power. I love the power of the hashtag, generally speaking, but the way that it's been utilized by Black Twitter, the brilliance of the Black Lives Matter, movement and hashtag, and what that has meant. It's given people a way to inform themselves, to coordinate. On the flip side of that, too, though, we have to be cautious about armchair activism. I think if we're not careful, you're going to raise a generation of people who think that a like or a click or a retweet is enough, and it's not. We have to get people away from their keyboards and into these meetings in front of decision makers, so they can be a part of the activism that is politics. I think about Umi Salah, formerly known as Phil Agnew, and the Dream Defenders, that they took a blackout for several months from social media for that very same reason. I think there was a real concern on their part that people were just getting too caught up in the imagery of activism as opposed to the actual has to be a balance that takes place there.
And I was going to ask one of my questions, what advice or what do you think, or do you think people really have to check their own racial bias when discussing Black Lives Matter or when even covering Black Lives Matter? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
For me, again, as a reporter, I think like your job is to present a fair and balanced story and what that is. Like whatever your own personal biases may be, should not get in the way of your reading, right? Like you should be able to still present the story and present it fairly, and with nuance and explain exactly what is happening, whether it's the specific Black Lives Matter movement or the social issues and other things tied to that. I think you just need to be able to do that well, and part of that is just, to me, being a good journalist, you know, being able to tell stories, tell them fairly, from a wide range of perspectives and voices, because Black Lives Matter is Black Lives Matter. It's housing, it's poverty, it's jobs, it's trans women lives matter. There's all this intersectionality in Black Lives Matter that goes beyond, like I said, like the obvious storylines that oftentimes we see those. But again, when I talk to Black Lives Matter folks and folks who are like in activism here in Miami who are leading some of this stuff, it is those stories. It's what they're working on, right? They're working on social justice issues. They're working on housing. They're working on poverty. And those stories have to be told. And how do you tell those stories? Because they're not going to Black Lives Matter, you know, a quote-unquote social group and going to like a leader or a representative and say, talk to me about poverty. It's going into the Miami community and finding out what is that story here. The Black Lives Matter story in Miami might not exactly mirror that in Chicago or that in New York when we get down to what are some of the topics and issues in our community that needs to be covered.
Mm-hmm. And I want to echo your point about who's doing the work locally. It may not happen under the umbrella of a hashtag, but I think about
Exactly.
Valencia Grunder and her work with Make the Homeless Smile. We had some connections with her through the campus because I was able to get our students connected to her to send water to Flint as a part of that effort. I think about Danny Agnew with the Roots Collective and the wonderful things they're doing in the community, from the Color of Love bike ride to the Black Marketplace that are dealing with, you know, real economic issues, kind of outreach and mentoring issues with youth in Liberty City and Miami Gardens. Those things tend to fly under the radar, but that's real necessary and powerful work that is going on. So I think we have the opportunity to lift up those stories and to lift up that work and that example for other people who may want to get involved.
So this question goes for either one of you is from our audience, and they say, why do you think that we don't have as many Black journalists out here? Just point blank period. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I don't know why there aren't more Black journalists. I can speak from my own personal experience that journalism in general is a hard industry to get into. And I've seen a wide range of journalists come through the newsrooms. I mean, our interns tend to be very diverse. Sometimes they don't stay in the field because of various reasons. So I don't know if there's a clear-cut reason why there aren't more Black journalists in the newsrooms, but I definitely know that that's a conversation that's been going on for a very long time.
Mm. And it's regrettable. It's such a position of power, you know, to be able to use your pen, use your microphone to provide perspective is absolutely necessary. And I think we still suffer under that. I mean, the ongoing debate about the portrayal of Blacks in the media, you can only begin to address some of that if you have people who are in those fields who understand. I mean, Nadege just talked about, she's a Miami girl, she knows these people, she goes in. Who else is going to do that? And race doesn't matter, but it would be great if we had more representatives from within our community who are going out and doing that work.
Dr. Hobbs, I want to ask you a question. When it comes to the election that we have going on for our presidential election, do you think that there's been a lot of talk with the candidates about Black Lives Matter and the movement, or do you think that there should be more of a talk about that? What are your thoughts?
It's been a beautiful thing to watch. I remember when the Black Lives Matter activists interrupted Bernie Sanders during his, one of his junket trips and forced the conversation. They kept showing up. They were shouting at Hillary Clinton, and look what has happened. I mean, very soon after that, Bernie Sanders got a person of color to come into his campaign and advise him. He's since issued a platform that will address some of this. Hillary Clinton is now saying that she's going to make, kind of racial issues and fighting against racism a part of the work that she does in the White House. So it's pretty amazing that we now have presidential candidates who are openly and actively engaging with these activists and around the conversation of racial inequity in this country. So I think that could not have happened but for all of the energy that had been building up to that point. Now, what happens now is the question. We'll see where that goes. I know that there was the meeting with Barack Obama where some of the activists, Rose Clemente, refused to go. She felt like it was a photo op and the whole nine. I know Patrice Cullors, who was supposed to be with us tonight, has refused to endorse, as many of the other activists have said that they just want to hang back and wait to see what's going to happen. So they're playing it smart. I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by what I see.
We have another question from an audience member, Jason Brown. It's for Nadege. Have you ever been put in a position where you were told to write a story from a specific slant that you kind of felt was not accurate? And if so, what was your response? What'd you do?
No, I have never been in that position, though I have turned in a story and an editor would ask or would try to maybe change the language or something, and I'll fight back. I'm like, well, the reason I chose this particular language is this is why. So I mean, in the newsroom, and no matter what you cover, there will always be pushback with your editors, and sometimes as a reporter, it's just about standing up for your work and being able to explain that here's why the reporting is this, right? Going beyond fact checking and making sure your information is correct. Sometimes language, right, matters. Tone matters. How you say things matter, because people will read it and think oh, this is it because of the tone or the language. And so I'm very particular about words and the words we use to describe communities, especially underserved quote-unquote communities or impoverished communities. There are certain trigger words for me that just are not necessary. And so I always will fight back, or I'll say look, this is why I choose that. And often, almost all of the time, I will say that, long as I have a good explanation, my editors will say, okay, well, I get where you're coming from. But sometimes you do have to push back. And it's not because the editor is racist and just wants a certain angle on something. But, when you know a community differently, your editors are not necessarily the experts in the communities you cover. They're the last eyes on your stories, but you have to trust yourself in knowing that you know what you're talking about. A funny example is I did a story on Rest in Peace T-shirts in Liberty City, RIP T-shirts, and how they're a catalog of death in the Black community. You go into any of these stalls and you can see the face of Black Miami and who dies. And I remember I had an editor who goes, "That's a thing?" Just didn't even know that this was a thing, and that just came out of a place of not knowing. I mean, unless you hang out in the Liberty City flea market and you're in these neighborhoods, sometimes you don't know what is the trend or what's happening. And so you just have to trust yourself as a journalist in being able to push back and say, well, here's why this is what it is, because you did the work and you did the research. And at the end of the day, as a reporter, it's your name on that story. And trust me, I've gotten many calls about a headline, why is this the headline on your story? And I'm like, I didn't write it, but it's still my name on there, right? So I'm who's held accountable. So I definitely push back if I think that something should stand or that there's a reason why this is in here. So But no, I'm not given particular slants. Like editors don't go in and say, hey, here's the story that you're writing out of Overtown today. That's not how it works. I'll pitch a story. I'll say, this is what I'm working on. I turn in my story, and then we work through it. But it's never like, here's what you're going in to write about, because you just never know. Sometimes I go into a story thinking this is the story, and after reporting it, that was not the story. And as a reporter, you have to be able to make that shift and not try to fit a square into a circle. So there's that as well.
So you kind of touched on that in that answer, but I want to ask both of you, because this is a question from our audience. And if we had more Black journalists, do you think that the perspective of Black communities change, or does it really not matter? I mean, if you're in a community, you're reporting on it, you know what's going on, does it matter what the color of your skin is? You're right.
I don't think that because you're a Black journalist, you know what's going on in the community. You know, being Black doesn't mean you're plugged in unless you're plugged into the community because you're doing your job. It is very likely that you could be a Black journalist who doesn't have a clue about what's happening in the Black community because you're behind your desk all day and reading press releases. So,
I know you want to say it. I'll say Don Lemon. You want to say it out.
Oh, I wasn't going to say that. I totally wasn't going to say that. But, I mean, the point is, yes, it's good to have perspective in the newsroom. Like, there are things that I've seen, and I'm like, probably if there was someone of color in the newsroom, they may have been able to flag this. Even as a Haitian American reporter, I remember we had an intern once who said she was going to do a story about upscale Haitian restaurants. And she said, oh, I'm going to do it on Chef Creole. And I'm like, that's not really upscale. That's kind of like most other restaurants, you know, drive-in kind of fast food place. But I knew that, right? Because I eat there and I know what upscale Haitian restaurants look like. And so the point is, it's because I knew. So being a Black journalist doesn't make you know. It means, like, to know, you have to be out in the communities. So I don't think you get like a default stamp for being Black, like, okay, you're Black, here's your Black pass, you can go cover the Black community. Because I will tell you, I get pushback all the time in Black communities when I go out and cover them, and cover the community. Like, you don't get a pass like, oh, you're a Black journalist, yay, we love you because you're Black. I mean, that's not how it works.
Mm-hmm. I still will bring up the point about, yes, we can have good people doing good work and throwing it out, but, you know, I do wonder sometimes how far we can penetrate into, you know, the society that is still very much white dominated, and stereotypes. Stereotypes are so painful and so difficult to work through. The roots date back to the colonial era in this country, and you know, it's very frustrating for me. I think even as a historian, and especially when I think about what I see in the media and what comes back from those stories, it's really frustrating when we talk about power dynamics and systems. Can we train our public to think differently about matters of race? Can we really and truly convince them that Black Lives Matter? I'm really intrigued actually by a hashtag that's used by the Association of Black Psychologists, which is I value Black lives. I think that that is a very warm invitation and a different way of thinking about the same issue. And it, you know, again, going back to what Nadege was saying, language matters, and that kind of linguistic trick, I think, is something that ought to be explored and exploited.
Sorry, my computer just froze. Okay, so one of the questions that we're getting from the audience is in regards to Beyoncé's Super Bowl performance of Formation. So the question is, do you think the performance helped to further the Black Lives Matter movement, or do you think that the Black Panther references alienated a lot of people and discredited the movement?
I'll talk about that. I loved the video the day before. As a historian, all of the references to Creole culture, Louisiana culture, I just dug and loved. But I said to myself, there's no way that she's performing this at the Super Bowl. Lo and behold, there she is in the outfits, and I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. There was so much debate about Beyoncé, and I think back to the whole conversation about Beyoncé as a feminist or not. But I embrace that. I think anything in the popular sphere that helps to elevate and people's consciousness and to generate a conversation. At least people were talking about, debating the legacy of the Black Panthers. And you see PBS kind of leverage that, right, to talk about their documentary that they aired maybe a week later on the history of the Black Panthers, which was a really great opportunity for people to educate themselves about the history of this organization. Again, the problem goes back to a public that doesn't dig very deep and is willing to run with a headline. And for many people, their orientation to the Panthers is not positive. That they were dangerous, that they were confrontational, that they spewed hatred. None of which is foundationally true. But again, when we talk about majority communities and how they view our history and our images, I think it becomes problematic. But that moment for us, I think, was really special. I'm very proud of her. I'm very proud of Kendrick Lamar and what he did at the Grammys. I hope to see more of that. I think we need art that really reflects the time.
You said that a lot of people were talking about her Super Bowl performance. My question is, I don't know. I think that it went over a lot of people's heads. Like, a lot of people didn't understand the Black Panther the uniforms, her, putting her hand up for Black Power. Do you think that a lot of people got it, or do you think it went over a lot of people's heads and they were just like, oh, it's Beyoncé performing?
I think they got it, and if they didn't get it, they were told later. I mean, when you think about all the press that came out of that, both for the positive and for the negative, it was a huge moment, and those berets and afros are just iconic like that.
Sorry, my computer broke up again. Nadege, what are your thoughts about the Formation Super Bowl performance?
I like Beyonce. I thought it was a good performance. The hoopla that came after, I was a bit shocked. I was like, when the protests were protesting Beyonce and everything else. But I think that's part of what we have seen when it comes to the expression of I was at Miami-Dade the other day, and one student asked this question. She was like, I guess it's okay to be Black, but it's not okay to be unapologetically Black, or you can't be too Black, or what does it mean? It's the SNL skit, right? Everyone's like, oh shoot, Beyonce's Black.
Right.
She's always been Black, but now she's talking about Black people stuff, and it makes people uncomfortable. I mean, as someone who's a lover of the arts, I think sometimes the arts specifically, sometimes it's meant to make people uncomfortable, but I didn't particularly walk away with any sort of disparaging thoughts on the performance or anything like that. I just thought, this is what it was, and that was it. But, I think it's part of, what we have seen and will continue to see, which is sometimes when you see certain images or certain things, there will be pushback. There will be pushback, and, that's part of it.
So I was watching the news to see how different... Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I was so glad Nadege skit, because I think that was a very humorous and accurate encapsulation of people's reaction to Beyonce, and I think what we're seeing now with all of these protests from the fraternal orders of police around the one in Miami that really kicked it off. I'm going to keep my eye on that. I'm very interested in it. What price is Beyonce going to have to pay for trying to make a statement that wasn't a slap? And again, this is my contention. You can have an intended message that is to uplift and defend Black people, but when that goes to the other side, can it be received as what it is? Beyonce's positive message of awareness and just giving light to the trouble that is taking place throughout our nation has been interpreted as her being anti-police, and she's facing this backlash that is really being driven. I mean, I see a lot of these things coming through my feed that speak to that. Where is this going to end for her? Where is this going to end for us? Do we have the power to drive that narrative and really defend and speak to what her intentions were? Or are people just going to drown it out, write her off, and we'll keep things moving? That is what I'm waiting to see.
We have a question on... Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say from the Miami response, like Javier Ortiz is Javier Ortiz and the Fraternal Order of Police. The City of Miami Police Department has distanced themselves far, far away from his comments and have said that, you know, like with any major event, this event will be patrolled. It will not be missing any police officers because of Javier Ortiz. That's not going to happen. And black police officers and community members have also come out and condemned those statements and said that he does not speak for everyone. And he surely doesn't speak for all of us. So, I mean, as a fraternal order of police, he has wide latitude to say things without any sort of discipline. There are a lot of things that if a normal patrol officer would say that, they would probably get disciplined, but because it's the FOP, they have, you know, different rights than like a regular patrol officer. But I would just say, as it comes to the City of Miami, they have distanced themselves from those comments. And in fact, one of my colleagues at the Herald, Chuck Rabin, wrote an article on how they're actually exploring options to figure out what they can do to stop FOP, specifically Javier Ortiz, from making such inflammatory comments, because this is not the first time he's done something like this. This is his MO. This is what he's known for. So.
Mm-hmm. Can I just make a point though on that? And I hear you in that on the practical aspect of it is that there will be coverage. Then it's coming out of Tampa that there will be, you know, coverage from the police, even though there was some rumor to the contrary. But the other angle for media though is what Javier Ortiz has done is inserted this that police should be angry at Beyoncé. And I think that is the piece that we're going to continue to see live and grow. And where that goes, how that spreads, I am very interested to see.
One of the questions that we have from the audience is in regards to hashtags, and we have hashtags All Lives Matter, hashtag Blue Lives Matter. How or do you think that those hashtags are impacting or affecting the Black Lives Matter movement? I mean, what role do they play in that? And I mean, you're talking about Fraternal Order of Police, and that's Blue Lives Matter. I know they had the meme, they tweeted out, boycott Beyonce, or back the blue, boycott Beyonce. Anyway, the hashtag Blue Lives Matter, does that play a role in the Black Lives Matter movement?
I just think that it just goes to the tone deafness that we see time and time again. You know, if someone was talking about breast cancer, do we get someone else? Prostate cancer matters. You know, it's that type of foolishness, and I really get discouraged. I think one of the things that made me irritated was Chick-fil-A. And Chick-fil-A's, you know, kind of comeback at Black Lives Matter to create an initiative that was going to support the police and to come out as pro-police. When I saw that, it was just like, how can you ever create a dialogue and when their fundamental position, unwavering position, no matter what you do, is to defend the police? It's very frustrating that people can't hear and absorb a very simple message, which is you can't leave us lying in the street for hours and not do anything. That's disrespectful. Like with Trayvon Martin, that you can't allow a boy to be shot and not investigate. It is just abhorrent to our sense of humanity that these things go on, and we have to do something about it. And that is really frustrating when you have the police being weighed against the legitimacy of Black voices. That's a really, really tough thing to overcome, and it's a very hard dialogue to have.
Do you think that people are using the hashtag in spite or ignorance?
Spite and ignorance, but mostly spite.
Nadege, do you have any comments?
On hashtag Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, I'm all about a hashtag. I mean, I think people are free to use whatever hashtags they want. Blue lives do matter. That's a fact, right? People's lives matter. That's a fact. And Black lives matter. That, like, to me, it's not one or the other or that one matters more. than the other. I've never gotten that as a conversation, which you hear often. It's like, well, if Black Lives Matter, don't all lives matter? I never, when I heard Black Lives Matter, I never thought it to mean Black Lives Matter more than ... That was not what I was hearing, but I do know that that is the perception, that there are certain sections and factors who say that Black Lives Matter is racist because it doesn't include everyone else. And one of the common refrains that you hear back from that is that if your house is on fire, if my house is on fire, you know, you wouldn't shout down the street where your house isn't on fire that, oh, well, come pour water on my house too. I think the reason why you saw the rise of Black Lives Matter is because of so many things happening within the Black community that pointed to questionable and just sometimes straight outright unjustifiable. And so that's what that came from. But of course, like I said, you're going to always have a counter narrative, and there are many against Black Lives Matter.
I have a question. Just a point. I mean, something that I kind of struggle with, which is, you know, it's the I don't feel like people listen and try to understand. You know, how can you look at, you know, a situation like a Trayvon Martin, like a Eric Garner, and not understand that, or Tamir Rice, I think is probably the most vivid illustration of this, and not understand that there is something wrong with the style of policing that was engaged in at least two of those instances. Of course, Trayvon is not really in that same category because George Zimmerman was a private citizen, but it is the lack of empathy that I hear when I read All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and you know, again, word you gave me, Nadege, which is nuance. You know, how can we ever get to the nuance that there are good journalists and there are bad journalists, there are good teachers, there are bad teachers, there are good cooks and there are bad cooks. There are bad cops and there are good cops. The majority of cops, I do believe, are fair-minded and do their job well. But there are some problematic cops who go out there too strong, react too harshly, and they end up taking people's lives. Why can't we have people just to recognize that as a fact? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know if you've had any insight into those, but I think that's a critical point if we're ever going to really and truly have a dialogue about this, is coming to a collective understanding about what this message is.
We have one question from the audience from Clayton, and the question is, have the body cameras that the police officers wear reduced the killings of innocent Black people?
Well, no one wears, I think Key West just started wearing their body cameras a few months ago. I don't think locally here in South Florida we've had any incidents where a police officer was wearing a body camera during a shooting. I could be incorrect. I know there are dash cameras that have captured some things, like Laval Hall, for example, in Miami Gardens. He was the mentally ill man who was killed. There was dash camera footage, but that did not capture the full interaction. It caught snippets of it. I will say that Florida has a very open records law, public records law, that gives us access to these things. But these are still questions that we're asking, at least for us locally here. Miami-Dade County will be getting their body cameras, I believe, at the start or sometime later this year. And there are a lot of questions on access. Even if there is a body camera, it does not mean that it becomes immediately accessible to the public, right? So, I mean, you could wait for years before that footage is available because there's an ongoing investigation. And as long as that investigation is open, there's a good chance that the police officers will cite Chapter 119 and say that as part of an ongoing investigation, we cannot release this footage. So I don't know if it will provide the immediate transparency that people are thinking, but I think eventually it does, because that footage will become available. But it won't become available the day after a shooting or even a month or a year after a shooting. And so I think there will still be lingering questions around the incidents that lead up to shootings, police-involved shootings, even with body cameras, because we just won't have access to that footage as quickly, I think, as people would like. It's not going to roll out the next day.
Okay. One of my other questions that we have from the audience, we're here in South Florida. We have a lot of Spanish speakers. Nadege, do you think that the Spanish media does a good job of covering Black Lives Matter?
I don't really know because I don't watch Spanish media. I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know. I honestly don't know what's like as an insider. I don't know what's happening in Spanish media because it's not the media that I consume.
Sorry, my phone just broke up. Or my computer broke up. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we hear you fine.
Oh, okay, sorry. So one of my other questions that I have is for Dr. Hobbs. So when it comes to helping to find groups, do you think are finding solutions to the issue of racial bias in the media, and do you have suggestions on how the media can kind of counter racial bias?
Could you repeat that one more time? My computer was slow.
Okay, so which groups are helping to find solutions to the issue of racial bias in the media, and do you have suggestions on how the media kind of counter racial bias?
Counter in the media, not really too sure about people coming back. I just think that when I think about that question, I just think about it in terms of activism and who can you turn into, who can you watch, who can you link up with when you get off your keyboard to go do some of this work. I definitely think about the Dream Defenders here on the ground. I think about the NAACP. They are the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. The Miami-Dade chapter is incredibly active with a slew of programs that are helping to address many different facets of this question. They've advocated for Law Hall. They've been on the ground with Catherine Fernandez-Rundle, talking to her about prosecutions of police, advocating for more understanding, more trust. I also would have to shout out the Black Lives Matter movement. The agenda that they have, the points that they address, really get at a lot of some of the core issues. I'm a big fan of Campaign Zero. I think they have practical ideas, policy ideas that if implemented could get us a long way down the road. That's D. Ray McKesson's. I think he's created that or he's supporting that. But those would be on my short list of folks who are out there doing the work and pushing back.
We have another question from the audience in regards to another Beyoncé question, formation. I do want to remind everyone we only have 15 minutes left, so if you want to send some last-minute questions. But when it comes to formation and Beyoncé and the whole music video, do you think that it was a good tool to kind of tell people who didn't know so much about the Black Panthers? I mean, what do you think came from that? Because I've seen a lot of posts on social media, positive and negative. And what are your thoughts? The Black Panther movement and how she portrayed that.
I'll let Dr. Hobbs take that one.
She's so over it. Nadege is over it.
A lot of Beyoncé questions.
Yeah. I kind of expected that. She broke the internet. I will say again that for what it was, I think it was brilliant. I will take it. I think it's got people talking, and it's the job of folks, like myself as an educator. It's been an incredible teaching tool. I have an assignment out with one of my classes right now. The title of the class is Color of the Law, the History of Racism, Law Enforcement, and Injustice in the American Criminal Justice System. And so I have them writing a comparison essay to look at what Beyoncé did in representing the Black Panther Party and also what Kendrick Lamar did in his Grammy performance to highlight the scourge of mass incarceration that we have and also lift up some really positive image of African identity and ancestry. So, I'll take it any way I can get it. As a college professor, I'm always looking for any new tool that will raise the consciousness of my students, and Beyoncé has done me a huge favor, so thank you, Queen Bee.
As a professor, what's the big question that you get from your students in regards to Black Lives Matter?
I think people get it. The students that I engage with around Lions for Justice, I mean, they clearly have been working on this for many years now, and they understand what it is. But I still will have the occasional students who comes by my office and just says, well, Dr. Hobbs, don't all lives matter? And I have to say that, it still kind of, gets me to have to break down to them, what's going on. So I think that they are picking up on these conversations, and my role as an educator, as a historian, is to give them that perspective on this particular moment in time. And I take that not only as a, as someone, as an academic background, but I'm very much a believer that we have an obligation to engage in our communities. And so social engagement and activism is something that I really try to encourage and push with my students. And so I'm excited to be at an HBCU with the population that I work with to try to be a voice and keep that light glowing.
Okay, so this is another question from the audience for both of you. Do you believe that the large protests like the I-9 blocking in 2014 went over the top?
You broke up for me. Could you repeat that?
Yes, I'll ask again. So, can you hear me now? Good?
Yep.
I think so.
Yes.
Okay, so do you believe that the large protests like the I-95 blocking back in 2014, was that over the top?
Nadege, you want to take that first?
I don't know if that was over top. It was a protest. We covered it as a news agency. I mean, I don't think it's really my space as a reporter to say whether or not someone's protest is valid or invalid. They had something to say, and they said it, and they disrupted traffic.
I thought it was brilliant in terms of strategy, in terms of driving attention. I had television at the time, and so like all the news channels were there almost immediately. But the problem is, again, is not just about these singular moments, but the movement. While you had the cameras and the attention, what was the ask? I never was clear about what was being demanded as a result of that particular protest. And so for me, sometimes I feel like we don't complete the circle in terms of the activism. I think they struck at a perfect moment in Miami while Art Basel was going on. They got what they wanted, which was media attention, but then what did they do with that? I'm not quite sure that it bore the fruit that it could have or that was desired.
Right, so once you get the media attention, how do you complete the circle? Like, what is next? What's to come from it?
I think you have to drive people towards, what I've seen clearly articulated with the Black Lives Matter movement and with Campaign Zero, that there are actually policies and asks that are being made of the city, of your county, of the people who have their fingers on the trigger. Well, that's probably an unfortunate use of terms, but who have their they're in positions of power who can influence change, and then also to get people engaged, to recruit. It ought to be a place where you're having the meeting the next day for people who got excited by what they saw, so they can come in and be oriented to the long and sometimes unsexy work that has to be done when we talk about mobilization and organization.
All right, and I'll ask this question for you. Question from the audience. It's not Beyoncé related, but it's Cam Newton related. Well, that's just one example. All right, so the question is, are Black journalists morally obligated to protect the image of Black male athletes?
No, I don't think Black journalists are morally obligated to protect anything. This is what I call the double-edged sword of being a minority reporter, is that sometimes the dominant culture, right, you can't report on your own community because you belong to that community. And sometimes our own community want us to not report things that aren't very favorable about our community because we belong to that community. Though I cover issues that touch on Black affairs, that touch on social justice, that touch on LGBTQ issues, I've never looked at myself and go, I'm the Black reporter. I'm a reporter. And so, and everything that comes with, right? So it comes with being fair, it comes with being balanced. And so I don't think it's my obligation because I'm Black to not tell a story or to tell a certain story a certain way because that's my people. That's not how journalism works, and it shouldn't work that way. So for me, I don't think there's an obligation to tell a story a certain way, because then that's like a slippery slope. I think your obligation as a journalist, period, is to tell a story fair, to be balanced, if there's nuance, to touch on that as well, but not to necessarily be, oh, because I'm a Black reporter, if you do something, right, that's untoward and you're Black, I'm not going to not cover that because you're Black, you know? So for me, as a journalist, that's just what it is.
All right, Dr. Hobbs, I have a question for you. What other constructive ways do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement can work to reach higher powers and to really make a difference?
Going back to a discussion that we had earlier tonight about what's happening with the campaign, the presidential campaign, I think this is a moment to keep pushing, to press these candidates, to get concrete commitments from them about what they're going to do to address systemic racism in American society, and to back that up with numbers. They should be engaged in voter registration. Beyond that, there are going to be several slates of candidates who are going to be running at the local and state level. Who are the people who are going to enforce and push a Black Lives Matter platform, for the city, for the county, for the state? Can we use the tool of our political engagement to move this dialogue forward? That's what I see as a very practical step from a political aspect. You have to also support that with, I think there's a lot that needs to be done on the ground in our communities to alleviate some of the suffering. I think, regardless of what we're talking about, violence, we were just talking before the timeline got started tonight about the murder of King Carter, the 6-year-old in North Miami. Whether you're talking about shooting and violence or politics or respectability, I think it all goes back to economics. We really need to be doing work around unemployment, economic opportunity for people in some of the areas in our society, in our city, where that does not exist. And so there's no shortage of work to be done.
And one question, I'm pulling it up right now. Sorry. So I did want to ask Dr. Hobbs, when you're speaking with your students and you're in class, what do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is? Is it going to slow down, keep going? What can we expect? What do you think?
I hope it continues. I have been, and I think Black Lives Matter for me is just one point in a broad constellation of just really wonderful, unapologetically Black statements and imagery that I see coming through social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. I think there's so much education that's taking place through those mediums, and we just need to harness that in a real way. I hope it does not go away. I hope that we do the work and study from the examples of the past, whether it be the Black Panther Party, whether it be Marcus Garvey, whether it be the Civil Rights Movement. We have so many examples to point to of how people sustain movements for the greater change. I would hope that Black Lives Matter is here to change and we can have a real impact, because we are in the middle of a civil rights crisis right now, and these are the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of today. I tell my students that frequently, that they have to get busy. They have an obligation to make sure that the gains of 50, 60 years ago are not lost, and we're frankly in danger of that happening.
All right, so we have time for one more question. It is for you, Dr. Hobbs. Olivia wants to know, do you believe that Black Lives Matter lacks a systemic agenda, and do you believe that the Black Lives Matter group should meet with civil rights activists more?
I really can't speak to that, because I'm not a member of those organizations. I kind of watch from afar. I do think that they are doing things like that, meeting with folks from the previous generation and getting advice from them. You know, I know that the Dream Defenders Power You, when Willa Davis was in town, had, you know, not only was it a public program, but they had, you know, behind the scenes meetings with her. I think she's on their advisory board. So they are consulting the right people. I think the bigger issue is the agenda and how do you work the agenda. You know, the political savvy, the electoral politics that, you know, we tend to not harness in the way that we should. I think there is power in numbers, and we need to take advantage of that. So that would be my hope, is that we see this kind of transition from a social media campaign into an active, on-the-ground political campaign that's sustained.
Nadege, I'll give you this question because it's one from Stephen. Stephen said that reporting on Black Lives Matter is not simple, and the audiences generally want simple. Video of shootings or beatings really, he says they don't explain a lot. What can the media do to better show the audience why the Black Lives Matter movement even started and why it's happening? What are your thoughts?
That was like 3 questions. Okay. The first question was it not being simple to report on these issues and how to,
right.
like, how do you do that?
Right. How can the media do that when it's not so simple? When our audience, they say wants, you know, simple. They just want to turn the news on and just be a simple story for them to get.
I will say that I have seen that a lot of these stories were not oversimplified, right? I mean, it's why Wesley Lowery, for example, of the Washington Post, as a result of all of these stories, could have just looked at it and said, okay, you know, Black men are being shot, and that's it. Here's the story, and we're leaving it at that. But that led to like a full year-long investigation into police shootings and actually counting police shootings nationwide, whereas before, police departments would voluntarily give that information and the FBI would kind of track it, but not really. So there were no clear numbers on police shootings. There were no clear numbers on who was getting shot, race, like color, nothing. There was no clear data. So that reporting was done by a reporter, right? So I think there are reporters who have gone beyond the obvious stories and did those deep dives as a result of Black Lives Matter. And I point to Wesley and the Washington Post because they've done an amazing job at, you know, pulling numbers, so much so that now police departments are studying the numbers that they did to see, like, how does this relate to training? What can we do now that we know what these figures are? And so I think part of it, again, is taking that initiative and also being given that space as a newsroom, you know, editorially, to be able to pursue those stories and not just the obvious ones. There was a part 2 to that question, but I don't remember what it was.
You want me? 1 second. Let me look. I mean, the second part of the question is, what can the media do to tell people why Black Lives Matter, like why it's happening? Yeah, is there any way they can do that?
I mean, it's just on reporting on the movement, and it's what Black Lives Matter says, right? Like, people who are affiliated with Black Lives Matter, the media can't make up what it is, right? We can't say, here's what Black Lives Matter is. Someone has to tell us what Black Lives Matter is. So, again, I think it's part of being out there and covering these stories. That's how you would get that answer. I don't think, unless you're a columnist, and then, you know, you can opine all you want, but I'm not a columnist, you know, so I have to report the stories as they are told through the community.
All right, so that's going to wrap up our webinar. Dr. Hobbs, do you have anything else that you want to add tonight?
I just want to say how wonderful it was to be with you two ladies and everyone who was tuned in. And I just want to encourage everyone to do your part. Keyboard action is great, but connect with someone, NAACP, Urban League, somebody who's doing the work on the ground in the streets, because we need all of us, all of our energy to help move this thing forward.
All right, great. We want to remind everyone that joined us to tweet at SPJ Florida and SFBJA. So we want some feedback. We want to have more webinars, and we want your questions, concerns, and comments. And we just thank everybody for joining us tonight. That's it, guys.
All right, good night.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, ladies. All right, Erica, take care.
Ooh.